What's going on, guys? It's Jack, back in to bring you everything you need to know about Cinderbrew Meadery. Starting it off, the open area is flooded with deadly trash mobs. Usually we'll save the trash mobs for the end, but this is super important. The very beginning of the dungeon, you have a lot of hired muscles and pyromaniacs, who are the most deadly regular trash mobs that you're going to be fighting. And then you have to deal with Chef Shui. So the big thing you want to be doing in this room is with the hired muscles, you kind of want to minimize the amount of muscles that you're pulling at any one point in time. They throw chairs, which deal really big priority target damage, and they have their AoE like mug explosion, which deals a bunch of party-wide damage to everybody with their like explosive brew. Now, what you really want to do in here is say maybe maximum 2 of the hired muscles at any one point in time. And you want to make sure you always have priority interrupts for the pyromaniacs. You probably are going to need at least 2 players to cycle between some of the kicks on the pyromaniacs. They put dots out onto players that can be dispelled. And they are also doing like a focusing flame from boiling flames onto players, which is just like focusing damage into them and dealing a ton. So you want to make sure if you have a lot of kicks in your group composition, then you can pull like 2 pyromaniacs at a time, but your healer needs to be dispelling constantly. If you're not as good with kicks, pull one of these pyrotechnics at a time and be very careful. When it comes to Chef Shui, the biggest thing with him is that he deals a huge AoE knockback, which is dealing tremendous amounts of damage to players. And so you need to make sure that you are aware of this. You cannot line of sight it. It is always going to go off, and it always is going to do huge amounts of damage. He's also going to be throwing around high stakes, which is going to stun you for about 4 or 5 seconds if you end up getting hit by any of these circles. So really make sure that you watch your feet. And then, like I mentioned, there's a Tenderize AoE cast that does a ton of damage. The biggest thing about Chewie is the fact that he is making all mobs around him immune to crowd control effects. So you can't really bring any pyromaniacs in with him. The ideal pull is that if you use Sap, Blind, Demon Hunter's Cage, Paralysis, any of these CCs to crowd control pyromaniacs, and then pull like attendants and patrons in with Chewie. That's a really good way to do it so that you can have some kind of mobs fighting him instead of having to fight him solo. You really don't want to fight any muscles with him because the Tenderize cast can line up with the AoE from the muscles, and that could be super deadly. Once you clear that room, then you are free to take on the first boss of the Brewmaster. Brewmaster Aldryr has a few basic mechanics. He's going to throw around tornadoes around the room periodically, which will stun you for a few seconds, and you really want to make sure that you're watching out for those constantly. He will also be throwing Cinderbrew at 2 players at a time, which is dealing some very large priority target damage to them. So you want to make sure that most of the fight is just going to be about healing 2 players at a time, and then making sure that you're in a position to dodge the blazing belch from the boss. Ideally, you're going to tank the boss near the entrance where you come in, and this is because 66 and 33%, the boss is going to go back behind the bar and gain an immunity shield or 99% less damage taken, and then he's going to start serving up mugs at the bar, which you need to use to serve the patrons around the room. There's 1 at the bar, and then there is 3 on the left side. If you are just entering the room, it'll be to your left. There's 3 patrons there, and then there's a solo patron on the opposite side. So you need to serve up 5 beers to your buddies. And you're also going to have a haste down at this point, and AoE damage is going to be going off. So ideally, your healer or your slowest player is going to serve the patron at the bar. Everyone else is going to run out, each serve a different patron, and then you'll be able to quickly move the boss into the next phase. Keep in mind though, if you tank the boss near the entrance, he will be running from that entrance location to the bar, and so you can still be dealing additional damage to him, but you are always going to have the same amount of intermission phases, so it's not like you're going to be able to like cheat a kill onto the boss at higher levels of keys. The next boss, IPA, is going to have a tank buster called Spouting Uppercut, which is going to push the tank back and knock them up a little bit. You also are going to have Spouting Stout, which the boss is going to use to spawn void zones all over the room, and also start spawning some of these brew drops. The brews themselves can be crowd controlled, stunned, rooted, you name it. But if they are alive too long, then they increase the speed at which they try to travel to the boss, and they gain CC immunity. So they do have to be killed at some point. If they make contact with the boss, they are giving the boss a fat shield and deal a ton of raid-wide damage, so you want to avoid that at all costs. The biggest problem is at the beginning of the fight, the Spouting Stout is spawning adds basically 360 degrees around the tank, so everybody in the party needs to be ready to use some kind of crowd control or knockbacks to get these brew drops out of the way, allow you to stack the brew drops together, and hopefully burn them down in close order. The big reason why you want to do this is that the brews will respawn eventually. They form a large puddle when they're killed, and the puddle continues to shrink until it coalesces into a new drop. And so your goal as a tank is to make sure that you have enough space between you and those former stout puddles so that you can watch when they're going to respawn, hopefully keep them pretty decently stacked together, and then when another Spouting Stout comes out, then you're going to be able to kite all of these adds into like one pile to be killed the next time. It's a lot about ad control onto this encounter, but you also have some prio healing as a healer due to the burning fragmentation. This puts out 2 magic effects onto players which are dealing damage, so you can have 2 players at a time debuff with this effect. Dispel one, prio heal another. It's a really good effect to dwarf if you have access to it. Highly recommend if you have your buddies in on voice that you kind of coordinate who's using their dwarf first, because this also goes out quite frequently. You can't really have anyone slack in killing adds on this boss, and you really need to make sure that stuns, slows, knockbacks, whatever it is being taken advantage of to make sure these brew drops do not make contact with IPA. The next boss, Benk Buzzbee, is going to be summoning crazy amounts of adds throughout the encounter, and there's only going to get more adds if you're not taking care of some of the core mechanics. He starts off with snack time, which is going to be spawning a bunch of these meadery barrels around the room. And these barrels are what are actually attracting the bees that are coming up a little bit later on. So your priority is making sure you're cleaving down these bees, and sometimes you might have to prio target them down if there's too many that come out, but once you end up killing these bees, this is where you can mount up onto the dead bee corpse, and then you're gonna get a new action bar, and you basically just have to press 1 while aiming the bee at some of these barrels, and they can pierce through and they can go very far. You can also move the bee around a little bit if you want to line up a perfect shot, but the goal is to mount up onto the bee, press your 1 key, it flies through the barrel and destroys it. Now, the bees do have some buffs that they can get, namely the honey marinade that gets dropped onto the tank is effectively a tank buster, and so if any other players are standing in that field, they're going to get close to one shot, if not outright one shot. Tanks need to make sure they're dropping these on the sides of the room, because if any bees are landing inside the honey marinade, they are getting healed. And if a dead bee gets killed inside the marinade, then they actually get resurrected at like 5 HP or something, and then they continuously are going to be healing. So tanks need to be able to tank that off to the side. DPS healers need to make sure they're grabbing these bee corpses and ramming them through the meadery barrels very regularly. Then you're going to have some of the AoE damage coming into the boss from Fluttering Wing. This happens fairly regularly, about 30-45 seconds or so, and does a knockback onto players and deals a decent amount of damage. Make sure you're not getting knocked back into any of the meadery puddles, and you're going to be just fine. The final boss is Goldie Baronbottom, and she spawns a ton of barrels around the room as the encounter starts. Now, this is very similar to Edna if you played in Season 1 with Stone Vault, in that there's multiple different large barrels with these like fire plumes that you're able to see around them, and having players with either the tank with the cash cannon frontal or players with the burning ricochet can stand on these barrels to activate them. Any of the large flaming barrels will ignite and then deal big ticking damage to the entire party when they are detonated. The goal is to make sure that you're clearing enough of these so that you are not going to have as huge of damage when the boss is going to enter into their intermission phase at max energy, which is unleashing just a hail of additional damage onto the group. It's actually called Let It Hail, and just blasting tons of damage, because that ignites all of the barrels in the room that are left remaining. And if any of them are flaming barrels, then they're actually going to ignite and deal damage on top of you. So the easiest way to deal with this, I believe we have 4 flaming barrels around the room. What I really like doing with it is having your tank be predominantly responsible for dealing with most of these flaming barrels. It'll matter quite a lot depending on what kind of healer that you bring to the table and like what healing cooldowns you might have. But what's really effective is having the tank with the cash cannon frontal knock out one of those flaming barrels immediately, and then it's immediately followed by a burning ricochet. If you are igniting those barrels right after a cash cannon is igniting them, then you can kind of roll 1 or 2 stacks of the flaming barrel into another 1 or 2 stacks of the flaming barrel, which is really, really deadly. You want to make sure you don't do that. What you would prefer to do is really just have the tank taking care of the brunt of them. And if you leave 1 flaming barrel up during the Let It Hail, the boss does activate it, but it's actually as the damage is almost over from the Let It Hail. So if you're a healer like a Disc Priest who actually has a lot of burst output, it could be really good to let 1 or 2 of those flaming barrels get destroyed by Let It Hail, and then you can continue healing through the hail damage and the dot damage at the exact same time if that works with your cooldowns. That being said, if the cash cannon is coming out immediately after the Let It Hail, and then you pop 2 more barrels and you don't have healing cooldowns, it could be really messy. So for ultimate safety, you could basically opt for your tank to just clear 1 at a time and then slowly kind of work them down. You have your players, the Burning Ricochet, bringing their circles onto any barrels that are near the boss's chair in the middle of the room. That way there's lesser players to dodge when they reach max energy and you want to stand in melee range to be able to DPS. That's a great way to do it, but it's one you have to really like coordinate with your healer. It's a lot better to make sure that no barrels are going off before Let It Hail happens. So if you see the boss like 90 energy or something, don't break any barrels, because then you have the ticking damage going into the hail, which can be pretty jarring and it's very easy for people to die. But in my experience, it's been a lot easier if you have Let It Hail break 1 barrel at the end at the very least, because that's always an area as a healer that you should prepare cooldowns. The ricochets also put out a magic debuff that does a little bit of ticking damage. You do want to dispel it, but it's not a massive amount of damage, so just keep that in mind. After you kill the Brewmaster, there's some priority targets on your way to IPA. Namely, you're going to have to deal with some of the careless hobgoblins, which are dropping off this reckless delivery. They're going to charge a player, crash into the wall, deal party-wide damage, and spawn a bunch of these just like brew drops that are kind of like nothing mobs. They're very important to make sure that you're aiming these away from other players. Ideally, you're trying to tank the hobgoblins close to the wall so you can just maximize some of your cleave damage. You also want to make sure the party is fairly close together, because you're going to have some of the taste testers and hobgoblins spawning these explosive barrels. And what the explosive brews are going to do is basically kind of like an explosive. What you want to make sure you do is make sure you kill off these explosive barrels as soon as they spawn. And it's very easy in this room, in this hallway really, as you head to IPA, for things to get very, very chaotic because mobs are just kind of running all over the place. This is where the more you can kind of tank these mobs against a wall or even into a corner, the easier it's going to get for you to start managing all of the extra sort of effects that are happening around the room. Also in IPA's room, you have the Flavor Scientists, which are casting this rejuvenating honey. This is not nearly as important of a kick as the Pyromaniacs are, and you're going to have a decent amount of those as you head into IPA, so keep that in mind. But you do want to bring somebody with a purge, because if the rejuvenating honeys go off, they start buffing at enemies and making sure that they're healing over time. It's very easy to purge these off. They don't heal very quickly either, so if you're limited on kicks, just make sure you have somebody with a purge on hand to remove these buffs if they go off. As you head to Benk Buzzbee, you have to deal with some of these royal jelly purveyors. Now they're doing a honey volley cast, which is an absolute massive priority to kick. It slows everybody in the party and does a crazy amount of damage. And their partner in the Honey Harvester is already dealing unavoidable AoE with one of their abilities. And then on top of that, they're also dropping a huge circle that you have to dodge out of. So you have a Swarming Surprise, which is dealing heavy AoE damage to everybody in the group. And then near immediately afterwards, he's going to put out this big circle on the ground with beeswax and then stomp into the ground, potentially killing anybody nearby. The worker bees that are around are very deadly as well, and they stack up a magic debuff onto your tank. But also when they get low, around 25% or less, they do a final sting onto the tank. So when it comes to using your AoE stuns, crowd controls, knockbacks, whatever, you want to be doing these as these mobs are about to die, or as they're about to try to final sting your tank, because you could have like 2 or 3 of these comboing your tank all at once, and it could just absolutely vaporize them. There's also some bee wranglers in this hallway, but they're not as large of a priority. They cast Bestial Wrath, which is an enrage effect onto the bees. You can soothe this, and you can always just kind of crowd control this mob as consistently as you can, but you must make sure that the jelly purveyors are kicked and are the absolute highest priority. You could deal with a little bit of enrage damage on one bee, especially with how low of HP they have, but it's really nasty if the entire party gets slowed in this zone. The Wranglers also are doing kind of like a line attack, which is going to knock players back with one of their shoots. This is not super deadly, but it's another prio target effect that you really have to watch out for in this area, because people can get dropped low very quickly. The last mobs you fight before Goldie Baronbottom are like the Yes Men, Concursor, Agree Gentlemen. There's a couple names for them. They basically just stomp the ground, but every time that you kill one of them, the rest of them are healing up to full. So make sure that you set up like 4 markers on these mobs, that you're always switching targets to the next one that you need to focus on, and everyone kind of knows that game plan. That's basically the most efficient way to do it, but these mobs are not too deadly, but it's very easy to lose a lot of time if people are hitting different mobs. So that wraps up our guide to Cinderbrew Meadery. I hope you guys found it helpful, and we'll be working on some easy press W routes and everything like that, which should hopefully be in the description down below by the time of this video. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Be sure to like and subscribe if these have been helping you out on your M+ journey, and huge love to our patrons for making all this content possible. Thanks so much for watching. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch y'all next time.